guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you stopped by today because today we are going to be doing another dragon art doll. Now this one is very interesting, but I did not design the layout and look of this piece. This one was a commission and this is the style that they wanted. So I did not create this dragon, I didn't design it or have anything to do with the designing aspects. I just turned it into an art doll and I thought it came out really cool, so I figured I'd share it with you guys and let you see how I made it. Anyways, let's get started. Okay guys, the first thing that I'm going to work on for our dragon commission is going to be the antlers. Now, I don't normally make a lot of antlers, and honestly I think I need to start doing more of them because I had a lot of fun with these ones. Now, I did make the wireframe ahead of time because it was kind of complicated. It just had a lot of wires involved, but it really wasn't too bad. So the first thing that I did was I covered the tips of each point of the antler. So I took a little bit of clay, I made sure it was kind of pointed and long, and I just slid it over each wire, and then I kind of blended it into the wire frame a little bit so it'd hold its place, and then I made sure that each point looked pointed and kind of sharp, but I didn't want them to actually be sharp. So I did all the points first, and then once I had all of those put on the wire frame, I decided to do a pre-bake. So I just put my antlers in the oven for about 25 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. And then once they're done baking, they're out of the oven and have cooled to touch, we can start adding clay to the rest of the wire frame. So for the rest of the wireframe, I'm going to take kind of thicker strips of clay and we're going to add them to it. So basically, I'm going to take a piece of clay, I'm going to push it down on one side that I want it to be on, and then I'm going to wrap it around by pinching the clay to the other side of the wire. And while I'm doing this, I'm going to start at the very end of the antler and work my way down to the base of it. So I'm just going to start adding strips of clay and blending it into the points and just kind of making sure that everything has the correct thickness, because you want it to slowly get thicker as you get to the base of the antler. So again, I'm just adding my clay, I'm smoothing it out and just trying to get a basic shape down. And then once I have a basic shape down, if I want, I can add a texture to it or I can leave it nice and smooth. And then once I have my wireframe completely covered, I'm going to put these in the oven one final time for about 45 minutes at our 275 Fahrenheit temperature. Now when it comes to sculpting the head, I will need the antlers done because I need them to mark out where they're going to go, but I'm not going to bake them into the head. I'm going to add them last because when it comes to putting the dragon together, it's going to be a lot easier to put it together if it doesn't have the antlers. I'm just going to take some strips of clay and I'm going to start wrapping this around my tinfoil and I'm going to blend everything together to get a basic shape down. Now once I have a basic shape down, I need to figure out where the antlers are going to go and what side is going to be the top of the head and everything. So for this, I'm going to add a little bit more clay to kind of make a nice thick base for the antlers to go into, and I'm going to add that to the top of the head and blend it in. And then I'm going to take the antlers and I'm going to push them into the top of the head where I want them to go. I'm going to make sure their position looks like it makes sense and it's the way that I want it and it's nice and even, and then I'm going to pull them right out. So whenever we do add our antlers, these are the holes that they're going to go into. So I'm not going to do much more to the holes for the antlers. I might have to put the antlers back in them to just make sure that after we're done sculpting the head that they didn't move around or anything. But right now I'm going to start focusing a bit more on the shape of the head. And then once the head is shaped the way that I believe that I need it, I'm going to start adding the details. So I'm going to start with the eyes. I'm going to take some little balls of clay and I'm going to lay them out on the face, figure out where I want them, make sure they're even, and then we're going to start adding some strips of clay under that and over that to make the eyelids. Depending on how much you want your eyes to stick out on your face, you might have to add a few extra strips of clay around them to kind of build up the facial muscles to make sure that they look like they're not bulging out. But once you have that placed, you can then use your fingers and your tools and start blending everything together into the face. And just kind of slowly adjust the shape of the eyelids to get the expression that you want. Now we're going to move on to the nostrils and the mouth. For the nostrils, I'm going to start by taking my thumbs and I'm just going to kind of push them in where I want the nostrils to start on the front of the snout. It's pretty simple, I'm not going to go too complex with these nostrils. Now for the mouth, the face is kind of thin, so I am really not going to be doing a strip of clay running from one side of the face to the other. Instead, I'm just going to take a large piece of clay and I'm going to push it down onto the bottom portion of the head, and I'm going to be making this the bottom jaw completely. So I'm going to push that in place and just kind of make sure that where it meets the rest of the face, it's nice and even on both sides. Of course, once I have it in place and everything, I can adjust and use my tools to kind of clean it up a little bit. Now this dragon also has some ears, so I'm going to be making those out of clay because they're kind of pushed back and they're against the face. So there's no reason to make them out of anything soft because I don't really need to worry about them breaking or anything. Normally if ears kind of perk up a little bit, I like to make them out of felt just to make sure that nothing catches on them. So for the ears, they're going to start off kind of messy. I'm just going to take 2 even amounts of clay and push them onto the side of the face where the ears are going to go. Then I'm just going to blend them into the rest of the face and slowly shape them and make them slightly pointed. Now the way these ears are pointed down, they do kind of open up a little bit more downwards, so I'm going to use my tools and kind of hollow them out a little bit. After that, I realized that I need to adjust the shape of the mouth just a little bit, so I'm going to add a little bit more clay to the front upper lips, and then I'm just going to blend that together and adjust it. It just didn't look like he had an upper lip, so I decided to just build it up a tiny bit more. So the face is pretty basic. I have all the major features in place, and this one is actually going to get furred, but I want to kind of add a bit of a texture to it because I don't want to fur the entire face, but I want it to look furred or kind of scaly underneath the fur. So a weird little trick to make an interesting scale texture is to take a seashell. The back side of it, if you get a really good textured one, works really well for adding a scaling effect. So I'm just going to take that and I'm going to kind of push it along the face, and depending on the direction of the pattern on the shell, you can make different patterns on the face as well. After that, like I said, I'm going to make sure that the antlers work still and that the holes are in the correct position still, and then we can put our head in the oven for about 45 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. And then while that is baking, we can start on the feet for our dragon. Now the sculpting for the front feet and the back feet are only slightly different, so I'm going to focus on showing you guys how to sculpt a front foot, and then I'll just show you the difference once I'm done. So the wireframes for these feet are going to be almost exactly the same. They're all going to have 4 digits, except for the front feet. They are going to have dew claws, but those are not going to need a wire to build them off of because they're going to be kind of flat against the side of the foot. So I'm going to start and take a lump of clay. I'm going to put that right in the middle where all the wires are combined, and this will help everything not move around so much when we sculpt the rest of the foot. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm also going to add claws to the tips of all the wires. So I'm going to do this to all 4 of the feet. Once I have that done, I'm going to pre-bake them to save my progress, and I'm going to put them in the oven for about 25 minutes at our normal 275 Fahrenheit temperature. And then once that's out of the oven and is cool to touch, we can start working on the bottoms of the feet. So the bottoms of the feet, we're mainly focusing on the bottom of the toes. So I'm going to take some strips of clay. They're all kind of roughly the same because the toes are kind of roughly the same. And I'm just going to lay them out on the wires and then kind of wrap them around to the front of the wire. So we're just kind of pinching them in place. So I'm covering up the wires, and then I'm going to blend all of these into the rest of the clay that's at the very base of the foot. Now since this is the bottom of the foot, you don't have to add a lot of detail, but I do like adding little creases where the toes would bend. And then once I'm at this point, I'm going to put them in the oven again for another 25 minutes at our same temperature. And then after that, we're going to start on the tops of the feet and laying out the scales. So with these scales, normally what I do is I just lay out the scales and just kind of layer them. They're just balls of clay and I kind of lay them on top of each other. But I wanted the scales to be a little bit subtler on the side of the feet. So what I'm going to do is once I have them laid out, is I'm going to blend the sides into the rest of the foot. And then once we have the scales in place, I'm going to add the dew claw. So I'm going to pick which side of the foot that's going to be on, and I'm going to do the opposite to the other foot when I get to it. So I'm going to start with the claw. I'm just going to add a kind of little cone, and I'm going to place it on the side of the foot. I'm then going to take a kind of short strip of clay, and this is going to be the actual toe. I'm going to place that right on the very top of that claw and blend it upwards into the foot. And then I'm just going to use my tools to clean up my edges and add a little bit of a scaling to the very top of the dew claw. So once all of our clay feet are finally done, all the tops are done and everything, we're going to do our final bake at 275 Fahrenheit for about 45 minutes. And then once everything is done baking, it's cool to touch, it's not hot at all, we can start on our painting. Okay, so for the painting, honestly, this piece has some pretty easy painting for it. So most of everything is going to be a solid color, except for a little bit of line work and shading. So I'm going to start with the antlers since they're the first thing that we finished sculpting, and I'm going to primer them with a nice kind of khaki brown color. So for this, I'm just trying to get to a kind of antler type color, so it is a little bit more watered down. You can kind of see the clay through it, and I kind of like that because it's going to make it look a little bit more organic and rough. So I'm going to completely paint over them. The tips, we're not going to really focus too much on getting them perfect because those are going to be painted a different color. So I'm going to go over that. I'm going to slowly change up the colors as the paint dries to kind of add highlights and shadows. And the base of the antlers I'm going to make a little bit darker than the top portion. And then for the tips, all of them are going to be painted red. And the red isn't going to blend into the color. We're going to make a nice straight line. Now for the head, what we're going to do is we're going to primer it white. I know our clay is white, but it's kind of an off-white, and we need an actual white. So I'm going to get everything completely primered white, and then we can start adding some markings to it. So I'm actually going to start with the eye, and I'm going to add black paint to it to give it a darker color. And the reason for this is they kind of are a blue glowy color, and I figured adding a shadow around the base of it would make them kind of pop out a little bit more. And since I'm already working with black, I might as well add a little bit of shadowing to the nostrils since I already have it on my brush. So I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to slowly add some blues to the eye until it kind of has that nice glowy brightness. And while I'm doing this, I am trying to blend it in. I'm not trying to just immediately go from black to blue. I'm trying to have it fade. That way it looks like it has a glow to it. Once the blue is completely dried, we want to make sure that it's completely dried, otherwise messing with it, it could peel away. So once that's dry, we're going to then paint in the pupil. So the pupil is just going to be a basic, simple line going right down the middle of the eye. After that, I realized I forgot to add a shadow to the mouth, so I'm going to add some black in the crease of the mouth and kind of wipe it away and make sure that it blends into the white, and this will just kind of define where the mouth is supposed to open. Lastly, I'm going to paint all the red markings that are going to be on the face. So there's a strip that goes down the bottom of the chin, there's markings that go around the eyes, and then the very top of the head and ears are going to be red as well. And that's honestly it for the head. Now we're going to start on the front feet. Now the feet, they're going to be different colors, so we're going to start with the front. So the front feet, they are going to be solid red. So I'm going to get them completely primered and have a nice thick coating of red on them. And then we can add a bit of a kind of darker color to the tops of the feet to have the scales kind of pop out a little bit, but not too dark. And then one thing that I like to do to draw your eyes to the toes and make them a little bit more distinct is by adding a little bit of a highlight to the tops of them. So where the scales are, you'll get like 1 or 2 little lines, and it just brings a little bit more attention to them. And lastly, we're just going to be painting the claws. So the claws, they're a very similar color to what the antlers are going to be. So that kind of khaki kind of color we're going for with the claws. And then for the back feet, they are not going to be red, they are going to be gray. So I'm going to primer both of those with a dark gray. I'm going to go a little bit lighter than I probably should have, and the reason for that is because I'm going to add a shadowing to the scales. Once my gray paint has completely dried, I'm then going to get some black paint. I'm going to water it down just a little bit so it's kind of runny, and I'm going to go over the entire foot with it. And then once everything is completely covered in that, really quick before it starts drying, I'm going to wipe it away from all the more raised up portions. And that's going to leave the darker color in all the cracks and crevices. Now this will take a little bit longer to dry since we did water it down, but once it is dry, we can then start painting the claws. Now these are going to be the same color as the front claws. So I'm going to paint the claws, I'm going to let those dry, and then just like we did with the front feet, I'm going to add a white highlight to the tops of the toes for the back feet. And then once all of my paint is completely dried, all of my clay pieces are going to get a nice thin layer of resin painted on them as well. That's going to cure overnight, so while we're waiting on those to cure, we're going to start working on the different parts of the body. So this is the pattern that I'm going to use to make the body of the dragon and its wings. So it's pretty interesting. The main body is going to be a fur fabric, and the under portion of the belly and back legs is going to be a short plush because it looks like that's supposed to be like a flat scale, and I'm just going to use a plush so it's easier to pose. So for the sides of the body, these are all the pieces that you're going to need. I have the left and the right, and then we're also going to have a strip of fabric going down the middle. So we have the main body, the tip of the tail is kind of more of a red, so we have a different fabric there, and then the underbelly is that short fabric that we need. Now the underbelly I'm going to dye real quick along with a bunch of other pieces, so I'm going to dye that first and then sew it, but I wanted to show you how the pieces went together. And then these are the pieces for the front legs. We have a left and a right, they have an inside piece for both of them and an outside piece. With these, we're just going to take an inside portion and an outside portion and sew down just the front to add them together. And then the back legs are done exactly the same way. They have an inside and outside portion, and there's a left and a right foot. And we're just going to sew down the very front of the legs, but these are going to get dyed. Lastly, before we start on the dye, we do have some fabric pieces for the wings. These are also going to have a left and a right. They're all exactly the same other than the fact that we need a top and a bottom, so there are like 2 of each. And the way we're going to sew these is we're going to sew down both sides and then we're going to flip them. So I'm going to take all the fabric that I need to dye, I'm going to lay them out on a surface that I'm not afraid to ruin, and I'm going to kind of spray them down a little bit so they're nice and damp. And then I'm just going to take some gray watered down acrylic and start adding it to the fabric. So I'm going to paint that fabric, make sure that the color is completely soaked through, there's no lines or streaks, and then these are actually going to take a while to dry. Now you'll have to wait for these to dry, but once they're dried we can use our sewing machine and we can sew the back legs, the wing pieces, and then we can hand sew the belly pieces into place on the sides of the body. Now the rest of the sewing for the body is going to have to wait until we're ready to put everything together. So what we're going to do now is focus on the wings. So this part of the wing is actually going to be the arm muscle, a webbing portion, and it's going to have some fingers with claws. So once we have this sewn together, we're going to flip it right side out, and then we're going to sew in the webbing. And basically what that means is we're just going to sew in a spot that when we stuff this won't get stuffed and it'll stay nice and flat and act like a webbing. Now other than this part of the wing, the rest of it is going to be feathered. So I have a bunch of different colored pieces of felt that I have cut out, and they're all cut out in different shapes and stuff that we're going to use to layer to make feathers. Now the larger feathers, I need them to have a red tip to them, so I'm going to take a little bit of watered down acrylic and I'm just going to paint the edges of them. I'll let those dry real quick, and then once those are dried we can start gluing our layers together. So I'm just going to use some fabric glue and glue my layers for each part of the wing. Now after I glued together the larger portions of the wings, I realized that I wanted to have a more kind of smaller feather pattern on the very top portion, so I cut out a bunch of red individual feathers. And I'm just going to layer these onto the very top portion of the wing, kind of creating a nice feathering effect. Now I did have to cut some of these fabric pieces because of the way the wing is shaped. It needs to droop down, and I'll explain it more when we add them to the body. But I needed to cut part of the wing off and add a little bit of fur fabric around the edges of it. And then I cut some fur fabric to fit on the edges of the other portions of the wing, and I glued them on the back side and front side. Now I'm going to take the body of the wing, that gray piece of fabric, and we're going to be sewing our feathers in place on that. So that fur fabric that we glued onto the feathers, we're going to use that and we're going to sew it into place on the gray fabric. After that, I'm going to stuff our gray fabric where the body of the wing is going to be, and we're going to add a wire frame to it. Now what I'm going to do, because the finger pieces are going to be kind of a fragile thing that could easily get caught on things, I'm going to be making these out of Instamorph. So the toe itself is going to be kind of a dark gray, and then the claws are going to be kind of more a khaki kind of orange color to match the claws on the feet. So I'm going to melt down some Instamorph and I'm going to start adding some color to it. So I'm just going to add some acrylic paint to it. So for the gray pieces, I'm going to add a gray, and then for the claws, I'm going to add more of a khaki color. I'm going to mix those up and make sure that I have good portions for each finger, and then we're going to re-melt them once I have everything made, and we're going to make the toes. So for making the claws, I'm going to melt down the claw portion, the khaki colored Instamorph, and I'm going to make a pointed claw. Then I'm going to melt down the gray portion for the finger, and I'm going to make a nice long finger type piece, and I'm going to push that claw into the very tip of that finger. Now you'll want to melt these a little bit more together, but not too much to where they misshape, that way they hold on to each other. I'm also using that same shell that I added texture to the face to add some texture to the Instamorph fingers. And then once I have all the fingers done, they've hardened and everything, I'm going to take a little bit more of plain Instamorph. I'm going to melt that down. I'm going to use this to add the fingers to the wireframe. So I'm going to stick our little Instamorph fingers into the ball of Instamorph, and then we're going to take that and we're going to put it onto the end of that wireframe. So we're just going to kind of mold it right over that wire and make sure that it has a nice grip, and we're going to let that completely cool. You don't want to touch it too much because you could loosen the grip that it has on the wire. So we're going to let that completely cool, and then I thought originally that I would glue the fabric around it, but I figured it would actually be easier to sew the fabric around the fingers. So I'm just going to kind of close up the edge of the hand. And then our wings are completely done. I made a wireframe for the body ahead of time, and we're just going to add the wireframe that the wings are on to that wireframe for the body. So I'm just taking a thinner gauge wire and just wrapping both of the wireframes together. Okay, now that we have the wings connected to the body's wireframe, we can start adding the fabric to this and putting everything together. So I'm going to take that piece of fabric that we made for the body, and I'm going to slide this over the wings. I'm going to make sure that it's kind of draped over the wireframe, and then we're going to sew the fabric for this around the bases of the wings. So the under portion of the wing, we're going to sew the under portion of the body just kind of in place, and then that strip of fabric that's down the middle, we're going to sew to both sides of the wing as well. And then once we have the body fabric sewn into place on the wings, that one portion that I cut off of the wings is going to make a little bit more sense now. Because the design of the wings, it kind of drapes down a little bit, but if I did that, it would kind of connect weird to the body. So I cut that portion off, and we're going to sew this onto the sides of the body instead of having it on the wireframe with the rest of the wing. So this will make it look like the feathers are kind of more down, but they aren't going to kind of pull or tug when you pose the wings. Now I'm going to take the wires for the legs. I'm going to cut some holes into the body fabric where they need to go and just kind of slide them into place. Once those wires are in place, we can then take our clay head and we're going to glue this to the wire for the neck, and then we're going to take the fabric for the neck and glue it around the base of the head. Once our glue has dried a little bit, we can then stuff and close up the body. So I'm going to start at the base of the neck and just kind of work my way down until I get to the end of the tail. And then after we have the body closed up, I'm going to shave the underside. So I'm just going to kind of clean up the fur so it's not so long. That way it's easier to add the legs to it. Now you can add the front or back legs first, it really doesn't matter. I just decided to do the back legs first. So I'm going to take the fabric for the back legs. The under portion of this is going to be sewn under the wire, and then the over portion, the outer portion of the leg is going to be sewn over the wire. And this is more of the hip portion. So I'm going to sew that in place for both of the back legs, and then I'm going to take the clay legs for the back, and we're going to add these to the wire frame. So I'm just going to take a thinner gauge wire and wrap them into place like we did with the wings. Once those are nice and secure, I'm going to take the fabric for the legs and we're going to glue them around the bases of the clay legs and let them dry. Once those are completely dried, we can stuff and close up the back legs. And then the front legs are going to be done pretty much the same, they're just slightly different because of the shape of the shoulder blade isn't the same shape as the hip. So I'm just going to sew that fabric in place, then we're going to add our clay legs, glue the fabric around the wrists of the front legs, and then we're going to stuff and close up the front legs. The front legs are going to need to be shaved, so I'm going to clean those up a little bit, and then we're going to move on to finishing up the face. So for this, I'm going to take my fabric glue and I'm going to take some white fur trimmings and we're going to be gluing this over the white portion of the face. I'll let that dry and then we're going to mix up some resin and we're going to add our antlers. So I'm going to add some resin in the holes for the antlers, and then I'm going to push those antlers in place and make sure that they're in the position that I want. Now for this, I will keep an eye on them to make sure that they don't kind of droop or anything, because once that resin has cured, they're not moving. Okay guys, and that's how I made this really cool dragon right here. I love him, I had so much fun making him, and I can't wait to send him off to his new owner. Now again, he was a commission, so obviously he is not for sale, but I do have a bunch of other art dolls in my Etsy shop, so if you want to check the links down below, you can see what I have available. I also have all the products that I like to use to make my art dolls linked down below as well, so if you guys are interested and just want to see what I use on a normal basis to make my art dolls, that's down there too. Anyways guys, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!